Hello, everyone, and welcome to our YW Discussions, Why Social Justice, reflecting on the World Day of Social Justice for our very first YW of 2022. My name is Taylor Curtis. I am the YWCA Dayton Advocacy Manager, Advocacy and Culture Manager, a former professor known as the youngest Black female tenured in the history of the country who has come into the community to be actively engaged in our mission of eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. I'm so grateful to be here, and we're so grateful to have you. We have an incredible panel of experts lined up for you today, and I'm excited to introduce them, and I will in a moment. But let me first tell you a little bit about YWCA Dayton. We were founded in 1870 as the oldest social services organization supporting women and children in Montgomery County. We are on a mission, and we are a champion of women and girls and all female identifying people in our direct service programming, our community outreach and education, and advocacy and public policy support. We operate the only domestic violence shelter here in Montgomery and Preble County, and a rape crisis center, also now known as our Center for Survivors of Sexual Assault, right, or sexual violence. We provide affordable housing and support services for women and families who are victims of abuse or human trafficking or experiencing sudden or chronic homelessness. We empower teens to achieve their highest potential through Girls Lead and engage men and boys in preventing violence against women and girls through Amend Together. We offer to the community, organizations, businesses, and institutions consultation services to help provide culture scan and to determine if the culture of the organization aligns with its mission and vision. We provide cultural competency training that emphasizes cultural humility and cultural respect, implicit bias training, diversity, equity, and inclusion offerings, as well as anti-racism training and justice programming. And we advocate for legislative priorities that address our racial justice and civil rights needs, as well as women's economic empowerment and women's health and safety. You can learn more about what we do at ywcadayton.org, but at this time, I want to tell you more about what we're going to do today. Our YW discussion is a catalyst for conversation. This is a dedicated time and space where we get to have real, authentic, raw conversations about what's needed in our society and how to make a difference. And we hope that you engage with our conversation today. There's a chat function. If you would like to leave a comment, we can put the comment up and discuss. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. We want this as interactive as possible as we flow in this conversation and we have this discussion to make the necessary needs and the necessary moves to have informed decisions at the voting booth and learn how we can urge our legislators and urge our community to make impact and make change. Since the 1800s, Black and Native women have been providing leadership in YWCA's movement, and because of the leadership of women of color, in 1946, YWCA began working for integration throughout the organization, adopting an interracial charter that established that wherever there is injustice on the basis of race, whether in the community, the nation, or the world, our protests must be clear and our labor for its removal vigorous and steady. We even culminated all of this information into the one imperative to thrust our collective power towards the elimination of racism wherever it exists by any means necessary. In 2007, the General Assembly of the United Nations declared February 20th as the annual World Day of Social Justice. This conversation today is about the World Day of Social Justice, the history of global social justice endeavors, why we even need a World Day of Social Justice, and the continued barriers that prevent female identifying people, women of color, and even all people of color and all people who are marginalized from being able to achieve the needs of their own groups. We're looking ahead to see how we can influence public policy and make voices heard and be a community that can thrive as opposed to a community that is simply surviving. We look forward to this conversation and we are excited to have our wonderful panelists today. In this panel, we have our elder of the community, Guy Jones, who is part of the Miami Valley Native Council. We have Shelley Corbin, who is a member of the Cheyenne River Reservation, as well as a representative for the Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign from the Sierra Club. We have Darshil Kaur, who is our wonderful grassroots community activist, circle keeper, restorative justice healer from Heart or House of Healing Arts. And we have Kayla Rothman-Zecker, international human rights activist and consultant. As we pondered upon how we were going to lead this discussion today, we could talk about lots of different things that we see factually based that are happening within our within our entire structure of our globe. We can talk about some of the statistics of how people are feeling and what they're recognizing, how female identifying people are overwhelmingly worried about their economic status in this country with the gender wealth gap, or access to affordable housing, or being able to have full range of reproductive health care, or access to paid family and medical leave, or safe from violence. We talk about how in 2018, 2 in 5 women reported experiencing discrimination because they're women, and people of color, women of color, experience racial discrimination at even higher rates than they experience gender discrimination. We can look at the indigenous and tribal and native women as all too often left out of the conversation, and the history of violence that has involved sexual violence and missing persons with often unresolved cases, and the lack of data that there is to paint the picture of the violence there. We could also talk about the individuals who have suffered sexual violence and the children who are exposed to violence suffering from rates of PTSD 3 times higher than the rest of the general population when it comes to Native and tribal children. We can look at half of millennial women experiencing discrimination because they're women, and 2/3 of women saying that Congress needs to take action, especially in areas such as passing legislation to end racial profiling, passing legislation that will allow us to talk about our history in the school systems and be able to avoid the issues that of our past by thinking ahead for our future. There are so many things that we could talk about today, and today we're going to start with a then, now, and how discussion format, looking at where we've been, where we are now, and where we want to go from here. So we're going to start today by talking about oppression and the injustices that have led us to the need for social justice around the world. What has happened then, and what is the cycle? And I would like to pose a question, and we can start with whomever is willing to take it on. What has taken place in our history to cause a need for social justice globally?
Not all at once now.
Right? I'll defer to our elder, Guy Jones, to start us off.
Repeat the question again.
What has happened in our history that would cause a need for global social justice?
Well, and I mean, it's because I'm looking at and it says what happened then and the cycle. And even in the sense that we're talking about justice and what is justice and people's interpretation and understanding of certain terminology that's used by, the much larger picture here. I try to stay away from such words as dominant. I don't like that word, dominant culture. That's like, because it is, when you begin to look at it, years ago, I used to advocate for the study of white people. And then the light bulb went off one day while I was sitting in a sociology class at Sinclair Community College. I'm like, damn, it's already been done. They call it sociology. But we still don't discuss that. And then it's like, why are we talking about racism? And that was one of the questions, years ago. I remember as a young man listening to such people like Stanley Looking Horse, Vine Deloria, a number of elders and people that, at that time and that I was listening to, Phil Deer. And they were questioning because we were just now being introduced to mainstream. We were being civilized. And so, we had these questions in the sense that even so much as justice, what is justice? And the Native people saw justice as a form of conformity. That, why would you want to conform? When we looked at, here was, suddenly we get cable TV on a reservation and we're listening to African Americans talking about equality. And we were like, why do you want to be equal to that? Why would you want to be equal? So we had these questions in regards to certain terminology that gets utilized, and we still, even today, when we talk about these things, and in the sense that, like, even this morning, getting ready to head down to Anderson Forest Hill School District tonight, and I'm like, it's like, when you begin to look at just what is this, CRT, in this movement, this anti-CRT, and and they're getting ready to vote on a bill in Columbus, but yet in the communities, and we don't have those conversations here in our own community. I mean, it's like, look at, just what, for an example, look at Stebbins High School, the Mad River School District, and that right there is, Wayne High School, the mascot issue. And even so much, and one of the things is that I have very few conversations. I have had conversations with a number of people, but I have very few conversations with a certain segment of leaders in the Dayton, Montgomery County area. Most of the time, the reason so many of them don't, and they avoid me, and they don't want to talk to me, is that they don't know crap about American Indian people, even though they reside on our land. This land is an occupied country, and they know nothing. And we have to look at, how is that so? Well, we got to look at the education system. The education system really does an injustice. They do not do justice to the original people of this land. And if they were better informed, and just think, if America was better informed, why are we not talking about white culture? Why are we talking about racism? Why don't we talk about white culture? And and it's like, and that's one of the things that, and I've been asking people this week, is it part of their nature, or is it something that is learned? I posed the question to you, and and it's like, and you came back with a very academic, psychological response. But bottom line, it's like, that's where we need to go. We need to get to that bottom line.
Absolutely.
Like, what happened then?
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
What
and
happened
it's
then?
like, yeah. And it's fear.
Certainly.
It's fear. Why are we not talking about white fear?
That is the question. That is the question. I want to defer to Kayla and ask, as you do your international work of human rights, when you look around the globe, what is contributing to the fear that leads to this oppression?
Hi, everyone. I apologize. I'm in New York City and there are some loud noises behind me. So hopefully you can all hear me. It's great to be here, and thank you, Guy, for your words. I think, and I'll definitely get to that question. Thinking about sort of the need for sort of global social justice, and sort of what is a movement, right? Like what is something that we're joining? And I really appreciate the question of, like, what is justice, and what exactly, how do we actually have a collective vision? And it really feeds into me and sort of my understanding of, is this about sort of interpersonal work? Is this about sort of what I do with another individual, what I can accomplish? Or is this about a collective, a collective effort, something that we do together? When I look at sort of globally different movements that have taken place, and especially, I've only been back in the United States for the past 4 years, and I think that's something that I struggle with a little bit, is sort of the American exceptionalism that that sort of taken themselves out of the global accountability, sort of that we're all related to movements that are taking place globally, and nothing sort of exists by itself in isolation. And I think that that's kind of a root of what sort of social justice is, why it's important to sort of learn from and provide tools and inputs and figure out collectively how to reach sort of common goals.
Absolutely. Darshil, Shelley, weigh in here. What are your thoughts around the need for social justice and the fear that tends to lead into oppression?
Hey everyone. I'm just sitting here thinking because I feel like we've already kind of laid out so many different layers of the situation. But from my perspective, I work primarily on the interpersonal level here at the heart with just the immediate people around me, and then with my students who are teacher candidates at Wright State University. And just thinking about how we deal with these issues in the classroom or just in our immediate lives. And to this point about the connections that was just in the last comment, the fear, I think I'm less inclined to to look into history, and I'm more inclined to just look at right now, just in my day-to-day life, and rooting out where do we carry fear. We all probably carry some level of the problem because we're all connected and we're all participating. And so how can we find that fear inside of us, or wherever we find separation inside of ourselves? It seems like this root here is separation, separation from interconnectedness, which is a truth of reality. And so yeah, I guess my angle is more so just how can we find whatever that root is inside of ourselves, and really get to the depth of it in our own personal lives, and then interpersonally with the people we are around, which Guy is one of the best examples of somebody I know in the Dayton area when he tells his story about that realm of the interpersonal. And I think this conversation is a great opportunity for that too. But yeah, I think to sum up my point, I think that whatever the roots are, they are inside of us. They're not out there somewhere in those people, right? We're all those people, and we're only going to move to the other side if we can move through it together. There's no just bypassing and putting it on those people. We kind of all have to move together.
Absolutely.
I'll jump in here. So social justice is interesting because in the Lakota language, there's no word for justice. There are similar concepts that kind of have the undertones of moral responsibility, like a right way, a more kind of it's something that's lived. It's not something that's really defined. So it's interesting because I actually just Googled social justice, right? Just to understand the term. And on Wikipedia, it's defined as the distribution of wealth and opportunities and privileges within a society. And it talks about, in Western cultures, this concept of social justice has been referred to the process of ensuring that individuals fulfill their societal roles. I think what's interesting when we break that down is that we were never part of that process. When we look at majority people of color, especially Guy and I as members of the Lakota Nation and other people of color, it comes back to a culture, really. I mean, ultimately, there's one thing that happened, and that was 1492 for us here. And so when you look at the let's call it the one-way mentality. That one-way mentality that's currently at play, that has caused a lot of the barriers, challenges, hardships that we are living now, is because there is this mentality that's been at play, and that has been created by white people. And so we were not part of that process. And so when you look at what's at play, even the term social justice, you know, and looking at that definition via Wikipedia, and everybody defines it differently too. Like, keep that in mind. Is, to me, it comes back to interesting enough, like this interesting concept of this like alienation of self, because it's still rooted in this individualistic one-way mentality. When Kayla kind of touched on it, which is really, you know, traditionally when, you know, we look at how the worldview of Indigenous people, it's always been based on a collective whole, a part of this greater society, that there was these systems and that we were a part of one another to include the living world. And the traditional knowledge of Indigenous people that have been passed down have been done so via culture, language, and traditional practices like ceremonies that really define, you know, experiences. And so for us, you know, as Indigenous people, a lot of, you know, how we think is still, you know, I mean, a lot of us have, the majority of us, in terms of this one-way mentality, have found ourselves living those lives. That's what we support. There is one system right now, and there are a multitude of movements across the world to shift to a collective system that is based, you know, in those concepts of thriving and sustainability and regenerative at that community level. And so really, you know, to name it, it is this one-way mentality that is being created by, you know, white people, that we are all essentially supporting. So I would then turn around and ask the question of, are we trying to, our members here in the community that's listening, are you trying to achieve social justice within the existing system, within the one-way mentality? Or are you trying to learn a completely new mentality? And so I would actually ask the question for food for thought, because a lot of people are working at trying to, you know, are working at trying to make life better within the existing system.
Mm-hmm.
And that can have its unique challenges of, you know, being stopped all the time because there's a bigger problem, which is the mentality of the larger system. And with that, I'll check.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. And I believe that we see these ideas of how do we reform the system that exists as opposed to dismantling and starting over.
So stop using re. I mean,
Right?
you know, and that's one of the things is that, you know, that's just like there's a movement here in Dayton, reimagine. I'm like, why are you doing that? You know, it's like, you know, we can see, obviously we can see what's happening, you know, and it's like, it didn't work. Why you want to recreate the wheel? You know, why you want to do that? You got to change that mentality. And, you know, and it's like, and, you know, what Shelley was talking about is that, you know, this whole, there's a part of this country. This is like right here. You live in Ohio. And there's so much that is right here when you begin to look at the earthworks and what is going on and these cycles and as a part of our history, our culture, our spirituality, and, you know, and being a part of creation and being connected to that creation. Our story is written right here. It's being destroyed by mainstream, and it's being hijacked by a number of people, but the story's still there. That's like yesterday I talked to Shelley about, here we have the spring equinox. It's coming up. And we are in that time. And if you know the prophecies and the teachings of this land and of the people of the Americas, it's currently you got people down in Mexico, women who are going village to village and rekindling the fires because it's a new time. And and it's like in those fires, it's not they're these are new fires. So how can we create a new fire? And and it's like, and we have to look back. We have to look at these things, make those connections. Our prophecies tell us that we just finished a cycle. And this cycle that we are in right now is the human cycle. And this cycle, being how it's human, where does it begin? It begins with you, a female, the woman. A woman is the giver of life. A woman is the one who carries and nurtures these seeds of life. And everything that you experience, we as men have a responsibility to see that your life, because all the emotions that you feel go into those seeds as memories, as a part of that. So we should be treating the female, the women, with utmost respect. And if we begin to respect the woman, that respect carries on into the seeds for the new generation. We are in that time. But yet, we have a segment of our society that doesn't want to do that. They run around and they want to talk about the devil. They want to talk about sin. They want to talk about oppression. They want to use all of these various terminologies. And it's like, no, let's embrace the energy. Let's embrace what creation has given us. So get away from that
That's important. It is so important to completely shift as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes it's a perplexing thought to figure out how do we do that in a space that you feel like you have no control.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we do have a level of control. And as Darshil said, it starts with you.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with you as an individual and how you show up and what you choose to do and how you choose to move throughout society and the influences and the seeds you choose to plant and the seeds you choose to nurture. What are you choosing to embrace and how are you using your space and your platform to influence? I see some thoughts going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Kayla, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of thoughts. I was thinking about the word conforming to justice, and I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm the ultimate conformer. But I wanted to actually say why a little bit. I was working in Israel Palestine with a refugee community over there and doing Palestinian solidarity work. And the assumption there, right, sort of the assumption there is that the law is illegal, right? When we're talking about systems, who wrote them, who are they for, who do they exclude, who do they harm, right? And there, and in America as well, I'm just going to talk from the perspective from why I ended up going to law school, was, that had to be the starting assumption. I think, something, I work in international law, right? And international law, and I love working with students who are thinking about law school and trying to convince them that you really should only go to law school if you don't believe in the law. If you believe in the law, don't go. Because understanding what the system, how problematic the system is. And, I always think I work in refugee law. And so I always think about in 1951, when the International Refugee Convention was drafted, the conversation in the room, right? And you can see pictures of that conversation are all white men, from across Europe, right? Drafting this piece of law that has dictated, the following 70 years that we still use today. And in that conversation, when the question was brought up, whether or not someone can be recognized as a refugee based on being persecuted for the basis of their gender or sex, they were like, no, let's leave that up to, that's a private, that's a private matter. Let's not bring that up. I think it was the representative from France who said, but what's fascinating is we're still using that document. We're still using that piece of paper that has dictated and has impacted so many people's lives to this day, in our misunderstanding of gender, of basis of persecution, of rights of individuals, of women, of LGBTQI, of people like this. This was drafted in 1951, which is arguably not so long ago, but as far as looking at the rights of people during that time, of women and people of color, should we be using that document is a fabulous question, and we still do, right? And so I love the question. I love the question that both Shelley and Guy pose. Sort of how do you leave that system, right? How do you imagine a new system? What does that look like, right? Who is contributing to that creation of that system? Who is part of that conversation? There's a lot of, I think that was talking with someone from Chile who's, and I think I used the word redrafting their constitution because that's what they're doing right now. And she corrected me. She was like, it's not redrafting, it's creating a new one. That's what we're not going back, we're going forward. And we're not even going to use that. And they have this whole process there of inclusive, bringing voices, marginalized voices that were not included in the previous constitution, and sort of how do you do that moving forward? I think it's a really good question. It's something that I think about a lot because as somebody who works with the law and inside the law, language is really important. Being very explicit is very important. Anything new that's written does not explicitly protect someone because the assumption that everybody understands who needs to be protected and what justice is, those are great questions. But that's because I work within the system, and I think it's a great challenge to that of how do you leave that? How do you imagine a new one? And do you is there still anything that can be done in that system? And yeah, so I'll leave it there.
I think that's huge. I think about, as you were saying that, I thought about, the U.S. Constitution and all of the amendments to amend, yet not to throw it away and start over. Which is in reality, which when the Constitution was written, it was not written in regards to everyone who is on the land. It was written in regards to the white people who wrote it and the white people who were thinking about their own communities at that time. And even some of the amendments to this day still do not support other groups of people. I mean, the 13th Amendment still says that slavery is legal as long as you've been convicted of a crime. It is still legal to enslave people right here in our own nation. So I love the concept, yes, Shelley, of moving forward. How do you move forward and move away from the things that have been? What is happening now that you see within your respective spaces that is moving us away from what has happened in the past and these systems that clearly are not working properly?
I can speak to that. Which is what I was kind of mentioning in the chat. So kind of to point out in response to like the 13th Amendment, a lot of those concepts they're not applied because we weren't there at the table to begin with. The table was built, those decisions were made, they're applied, they can't be upheld because there's no accountability there. There's no, circular accountability. There's no collective accountability because it was done by one group of people with that one mentality. But there are multiple concepts like that we are all, essentially, living right in this one system, this one mind mentality, one way mentality. And so moving forward, which is a lot of the work that, Guy and I do, and our other colleague, Cheryl John Cox, is, we have been taking the steps to essentially do the same, which is, we have evaluated, what it looks like essentially when people have lost their culture to this mentality, right? So every single generation, this is applicable to everyone who's lived within this one-way mentality, is that with every generation, people have lost themselves little by little in order to survive, because this is the one-way mentality that has been applied to all of us. And so with that, that leads to issues of social justice and environmental justice, right? Because of the concepts that we weren't a part of, that we were never at the table for, that were never created and cannot be upheld by us. And so moving forward, there's a lot of work and a lot of understanding as to, that system and how it operates. Is you have to understand that. You have to understand laws. You have to understand 6 dimensions of culture. You have to understand all these different concepts in order to be able to move forward. And then in that process, you have to understand, and I would encourage everyone to begin to understand and claim who they are. So who are you? You have to ask yourself those questions. It starts with you first in order to start that process of moving forward and shifting paradigms, so to speak. You have to learn what you don't know. You have to learn stories. You have to learn, your language. Me as a Lakota person, that is something that I have taken on, is to learn my history, learn my ancestors, which I can go back 7 generations, 8 generations. And my children, who are the 8th generation, will know back 8 generations at least. To know who you are and to start that process. For me, that looks like, talking with elders and sharing space, talking about things that I don't know, asking questions. It means building relationships. It means revitalizing my culture within my household. It means basically learning values, establishing values with my partner and living them. We basically model that. It's not something that's externally of us. It's not just words, but it becomes more than that. It's our life. It's our experiences. And it goes down to how we greet each other. In Lakota culture, we don't have greetings. We don't have good mornings. We have the word, which means I see you and I see all of you, and with that, that's why language is so important. And I think it goes hand in hand with the stats of, the remaining 90% of biodiversity in the world today resides with 80% indigenous people. And that direct correlation of loss of land and the destruction of the living world, so trees, animals, and these living worlds, is also a loss. It's also a direct correlation with loss of language. And because of that culture, when I went back to that culture and that language, this other, shifting from this one mind mentality, which has kind of taken over, right? Which is really rooted in this separation and individualism, which is really separate of the living world, separate of the earth itself, which is this whole concept. And that's what we're talking about. And so, and these spaces are the beginning of that moving forward concept, because it starts with, like we're doing, I've been doing this work for 2 years myself personally, and living, like being in that transformative space and living in a completely different space can put me in challenges within the existing system because, I'm somewhere else. And there's still that concept of keeping one foot in and one foot out while still trying to build a community of like minds to support that. And so, these conversations are the beginning of that process. I think it's important to think about what it means to you and your children in the future, what it means for your life. And learning is imperative to that process, especially in these times. And just that deep connection with other life forms, because we're not great here. We're not above the living world. We are a part of it. And so when you look at that perspective, we support, and right now the one-way mentality is doing a lot of destruction, and thus we destroy ourselves. And so with that, when you have that mentality of shifting that mentality to a collective, a holistic perspective, and live that, build the relationships with plants and go outside and see and make that connection, it's imperative in these times where there is more destruction than there is connection. And that's going to play out in the years to come. And so I'll check with that.
That is absolutely truth. Absolutely truth. Even from the understanding of the relationship of certain plants and crops within the ground and how it yields and how it begins to replenish the soil so that you can continue to grow and continue to have life, that has been completely destroyed in the current way that agriculture is done within this country, where we have these large plots of land dedicated to one plant, like corn, for example, here in Ohio, where the soil doesn't even have what it needs, to the extent of large corporations owning what they call suicide seeds that will not replenish, that you have to buy into in order for you to even bring food to the table.
What did you just say? It's not agriculture, it's agribusiness.
Exactly.
We have to get back to agriculture.
That's right. Because there's no respect of culture within it whatsoever.
No.
And these are the systems and the trends that are leading to food apartheid and destruction, as you mentioned. And
back to taking that seed.
Exactly. And there's a lack of sense of healing and restoration. And how do you even get to that space? And I want to defer to Darshil, as I know Darshil is a healer. Let's talk about what that looks like now. What is happening now that is starting to transform in some of these spaces, in sense of healing and restoration?
I wanted to share a couple things, but I think they're all like in the same realm, which is like understanding what we are for. Like I think we oftentimes, those who are feel inclined towards social justice, it's often because of something that we are against, or something that we don't like or don't want. or are negatively impacted by. And I think like a really important paradigm shift is to really focus on what do we want? Like, what are the things that we want in our lives? And or the things, not necessarily just what we want, but the things that we know are positive already, you know, like to Guy's point of like, we look at creation and what creation's already given us, you know, and like what are the life-giving aspects of that, you know, that we can uplift for ourselves and one another. But back to like my realm, you know, I'm teaching future teachers, and as many people know, the education field is one of that is predominantly women in that field, and I really see us like we're the you know, more and more people are moving towards like understanding our shared humanity, or just finding our own humanity. And then, okay, now that I've found my own, like I'm giving, and that looks like giving myself space to honor like how I feel. What is my truth? What is my experience? You know, what do I need? You know, just all of those things, you know, what am I longing for? And so I'm a circle keeper, you know, so it's a space that I'm able to facilitate people to like go within and even explore who they are and recognize like, yeah, I feel things, you know, I have emotions, I have, you know, a whole life inside of me that is not directly, you know, just what I'm producing, you know, or in my work world, but just who I am as a being. And then as they're connecting to that, you know, in a parallel conversation, we do examine like the culture of white supremacy, for example, and having them examine their own cultures. And as they're starting to differentiate and understand, like, okay, no, that feels like it's not good, you know, but this feels like it is good. So then as we continue the semester, like it's, you know, we have different topics that may come up, and we're always using those values as the North Star. So situations where they may have had previous ideas, maybe that they got from the news or from their family or colleagues or whatever it may be, where they think a certain situation should go like this. Now we're examining it through their values. It's like, is that how that situation should go? Does that outcome align with these values that you've identified as positive, or things that you think are life-giving and uplift our shared humanity? And it's so beautiful for me to just be able to witness like these light bulbs going off in their head. They're like, actually, I always thought that that was a good thing, but now I realize that that's actually harmful, because I wouldn't want to, like, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't want to be treated like that, or that outcome doesn't really match with my understanding of shared humanity, you know? So I really think like we are at a place where, I mean, even just for the trajectory of the classes I've taught, a few years ago, you know, it was more history and like, this is what happened, or this is what's happening. And it was like people who are in this type of educational world almost having to like convince, you know, it's like, yes, these things exist. But now with these younger people I'm getting in my class, like I don't have to convince them of those things anymore. Like they see it, you know, with all of the movements, they see the social media. So it's like, okay, ground, like we understand that like equity is a thing that's needed because there's inequity. So like how now, like let's have that conversation about what is the world that we want, and how can we build that culture in our classrooms, like within ourselves, and even in our classroom, you know, plus their future classrooms. So yeah, I think I feel hopeful that we are, at least me, you know, and like the people that I'm around on a daily basis, like having more clarity and being able to parse out like what are the most important values and priorities moving forward, and how can we like live them out today, and then challenge anything that's not that. you know, versus like only existing in, you know, this place of what I felt like was disempowerment when I was, you know, just fighting against all the time. But I went home and felt disempowered, you know. So it's cool because it's like we do have power because we're part of creation, which is which is life, you know. So it's like, especially as women too, but all of us. So it's like it feels hopeful, like just the energy feels positive to me in that way, that it's like we're moving in a good direction.
I appreciate that reflection because I think oftentimes, again, as all of you have mentioned, this whole idea of social justice has always been about fighting against, as opposed to looking within and understanding humanity, understanding creation, and understanding yourself as a part of this world, which is a living organism in itself, and recognizing how we all contribute to the world and how we contribute to the shifting and the changing that takes place, whether that's within what we see in nature or what we see in humans who are part of nature, right? And I think that that shift is something that is taking place in some groups and in some spaces. And I also think that transformation is something that people don't know how to attain. I think that people recognize that we are imbalanced in the world that we live in. There are imbalances in the mentality. And I love how Shelley framed it as the one-way mentality, and that we must shift in that. But I think there's a lot of people who don't know how. They don't know what to do. They don't know how do we move forward. I think there are a lot of people who are in spaces where they feel disempowered, where they feel hopeless, where they feel that they have no way to contribute. And I want to pose the question, how do we move forward? And for those who are watching who may not be connected to culture or may not be connected to their history or who may not be connected to transformative spaces, what can they do to move forward? And how do we remove the barriers? How do we remove the blinders? How do we see with a different vision?
I'll jump in. Not all at once, everybody. No, I'm just kidding.
I was waiting for what's her name, Kayla?
Kayla.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's got something to say. I can see it in her eyes.
Yeah.
So.
I'll be quick. So obviously the one-way mentality is built on, you know, let's say control, exploitation, and to build power, right? And to maintain that, you know, this, like, I like to call it like the vicious cycle of modern day violence, as we would then see, right? And a shift from that, you know, is in obviously yourself, as you know, we all kind of have mentioned in various states on this call. But I mean, and it's the want to move from that individualistic mentality into a collective. So it's doing everything that the system is not doing. And that's how I've basically looked at, well, understanding the system. If you understand the system, then you could do the opposite. So the opposite is, instead of siloing and, you know, doing everything alone and trying to achieve success and kind of, you know, moving forward to like this whole like currency and this monetary value and everything like that, do the opposite. So the values in people. And so once you kind of understand, like, okay, I personally want to shift and transform from this system, you have to understand the system first. So that's step one. Understand the system and how it works. And then in doubt, do the opposite. If you can't come to a conclusion, just look at the system, how it operates, and do the opposite. And then so the shift in your mentality thus will come along with that. It's the hardest thing I've done. There are times when I have just cried because there are parts of me in my mind, in my brain, new pathways that I have had to cry and let go, because that's part of that system, right? That's part of that mentality. And for one, it's done me, some favors by keeping me alive. So I've given it gratitude, but I have to create this new pathway in my mind, creating a new pathway to how I think and how I feel. So that's one. And then when you get yourself in a place where you're able to be present. So moving from understanding the system, and through that, you're changing, you're transforming yourself, and you're going to go through these emotions that you have, which are indicators to look at yourself, know that there's something that needs attention within your mind and your body. And moving past that, once you can kind of move through those and understand what happened and be able to understand why you feel the way you feel, then you can be present and be able to work in community and find those people who also think like you, who also want to build, a collective community, who want to shift paradigm, who want to, create a new future. And, that isn't just me. It isn't just me and Guy. It's not like the same mentality. We have to be diverse. You have to find others that have come from all different walks of life. It can't be just the same people. You have to be open to everybody. And that's where really that unity comes into play. And when you build that container has to be it's like creating a safe, trusting, vulnerable space, because people need to show up and they need to be able to speak their truth, because their truth is their reality. Whatever they believe and whatever they speak is their reality. That's how much energy and power we have as individuals, as human beings, as spirits we are. And then that space, when they speak the truth, there's accountability to that space to help people grow, to help people along. And that group accountability, that collective accountability, is that healing space that, that people have done the work in. And when you develop that healing space and you're developing these relationships and these connections that are so needed in this time, you're then able to be present and move forward with the community to develop the solutions that we so need at the community level. They can't come from the top. They can't come from these existing systems. They have to be developed by the people who are living them in community. And it's imperative that we have these relationships and these connections at that level. And so that would be my 2 cents and my advice on how to shift. And then that's the basis, that's the beginning. And then from there on is the world's your oyster and you're going to create it. So check.
That is so powerful and so important, especially as you say, creating these new pathways within your mind. Our brains are literally built with what's called neuroplasticity, where we were created to where we can reframe and reshape and restructure our literal physical brain just by what you're actively practicing and what you're actively thinking about and what you're actively believing in. And that experience, those experiences, and what you choose, and it's a choice, what you choose, that can literally restructure the wires, the neurons, the nerves within your brain, which restructures you entirely. And the intricate design that is there is something that we don't necessarily tap into in the way that we could, where we have that power, yet we tend to believe that the power has truly been stripped away. Kayla, I see you still pondering. Share with us what's on your thoughts.
Everyone's reading my face very accurately. Clearly no poker face over here. So I think that some of the words I'm having a lot of thoughts on them. And I think, one of, Shelley, your word sort of silo, Darshil, your use of like intersectional, and, I think a lot about, and it does give me hope, right? Because I do think we've made some strides in this and sort of understanding what this is. I remember when I must have been 19, and I went to a conference on social justice, and they had in the room a lot of, I was doing some anti-human trafficking work at the time, and they had a lot of organizations, just across the board, social justice, across the board. And they had a lot of farmers in the room as well. And at the time, I didn't understand the connection. I didn't understand sort of, food justice. I wasn't familiar. I grew up with privilege of having food in my refrigerator, and it was an incredible learning experience for me, because later when I worked with survivors of human trafficking, that they would get sort of some bureaucratic, justice, right, in a court system, and go home to an empty refrigerator, or go to live in the place where it's a food desert and like that. Does it matter, right? It's like, are we looking at these issues that are so interconnected, right? Can we talk about the right to education if there's no right to food? Can we expect kids to learn if they haven't eaten, right? And I worked with this incredible Eritrean women's community center, and I remember there was a meeting where a bunch of lawyers came, and they were like, we really want to represent, we want to offer these services for free. Here are the things that we do, and these women were sort of like, cool, but actually, like, we need help with, alimony payments, with childcare options, with, the fact that we're getting paid nothing for this, we're getting below minimum wage here, like all these other issues that these sort of refugee attorneys, weren't thinking about, because we were thinking about solutions in this siloed way. And I think, from feminist theory, like we talk, what is actually like intersectional work? What is it when we don't, when just all of these issues are interconnected, right? And if we cannot look at one of them without looking at all of them. And I was thinking, about, and I'll just throw one more thing in there on this, because it's the international lawyer in me. I despise the law around waging war, and like the reason why is because the only way for a war to begin, and this is sort of theoretical, and I apologize, but the only way for a war to begin is for an act of to use a weapon of sorts, and then it justifies retaliation. And we don't need to go into like, what is war? Why are we even talking about that? But what about like depriving an entire community of food? Like, is that not violent? Is that not the most violent act? Like, we just don't think about it in those terms. And it's such a problem, right? It's such a problem in the system. So I was thinking, Darshila, as you were talking, of sort of, do you have to, like, I think like a younger generation is sort of coming up in understanding sort of the interconnectedness of these issues, right? That can you actually separate them out? Like where am I in this system? Like where, like, it's like that, it's not for me. And I see that, and it's not just like, do I deserve a minimum wage if I didn't finish high school? Like, yes, and I think that that's more and more there's understanding, I think, of that in sort of the younger generation. So like I love the things that are being said, and I have this sort of that I'm, if people who know me, I don't think I'm described as like a hopeful person, but I do think that there is something, that I look at sort of the younger generation that's growing up in this, and that's able to do that sort of mind connection that, Shelley, you were talking about a little bit. I think better than a lot of us. I think that that's really important to notice. And I'll just conclude on sort of a last thought of mine is something, that I work a lot on right now. Currently I work on sort of transnational collaborative litigation against corporations and financial institutions, which is a whole other topic. But this idea, when you're building, when you're doing this type of work, when you're, we've been told what expertise is, right? We've been told of like who is allowed to contribute to this conversation because they have this formal degree or anything like that. But that is excuse my bullshit, right? It is just absolutely BS. And because we you have to see people's lived experiences as like the ultimate form of expertise. And I don't know where that fits in with because again, this is I think an internal conflict of mine of like working within a system, even though I think that system is illegal and shouldn't be, but working within it in whatever capacity I work within it, and also externally moving forward, I think that's an of mine. But I do think how do we do this in an inclusive way that's not excluding people based off of these sort of made up formalities, and someone's lived experience brings such tremendous expertise to the room, and to create more spaces where that's acknowledged and accepted. So.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think, there's so much, right? We could talk for hours and hours unpacking these things, and each one of you brings a different lens to the table that allows us to really dig deeper into the layers of it. And I think someone said that earlier, there's so many layers to how this all functions together and how we function together, and if we're functioning together, and if you even see yourself in the space to function together. And I'm thinking, today there's conversation with legislation here in Ohio about things like critical race theory. And I use that very loosely because the conversation is not at all about critical race theory whatsoever. The conversation is about talking about true history and true experiences across this nation, particularly, and how it has impacted First Nations, how it has impacted other groups of people who have been marginalized because of the history of this land, and how that is being referred to in the school systems as divisive, and how it is, and I think it's very interesting how the term silo came up, right? Yet we're saying that to speak in community about truth and to build in true knowledge is divisive. And so House Bill 322 and House Bill 327 are in discussion with legislation, as they are voting on bills, as they are continuing to amend the bills and changing and adding things to those bills. And how do we navigate, right? So we talked about, finding self and identifying self, identifying where you are in your space and identifying your connections, building your cultural awareness within yourself and your knowledge of self, so that you can then start to see how you fit in the bigger picture of community and creating collaborative and transformative space. When it comes to things like legislation that would prevent those things from taking place within the school systems and within even beyond the school systems, right? One of those bills is regarding, elementary school and high school and things of that nature, elementary to high school. But then the other bill is talking about even in terms of government-based entities like our military and, other spaces that are vital, right, when it comes to the treatment of people. How do we navigate now? What do we do now? How do we shift those things now, right? Because that's happening right this second, right? And someone's watching, they say, okay, I need to do all of this personal and individual work, and I may need to connect to community and become a transformative space. But what do I do about this when it's knocking at our doorstep? And I want to start with Guy, because I know that this is something that you are very passionate about and have been having conversations in communities with people who are against the truth, right? Who are standing in the way of truth, who are suggesting that there is no truth in the knowledge, who are suggesting that knowledge is divisive.
I'm muted. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. You know, when I listen to the conversations, when I listen to everybody's conversations and the terminology and things that are using, and Shelley was right. And I've had these conversations with Shelley in a sense that how do we change this up here, our mental attitude? And, and it's like, and Kayla was talking about, she used the word imagine. And in a sense that, it's like, you know, how do we imagine? Well, we don't imagine. We have to ask ourselves, is this morally right? Morally. And that's one of the things is that, and that gets back to a number of things in a sense that comes back to your truth, the question regarding truth. And it's like, this isn't, people say, well, this is the truth. Well, no, this is what we are talking about. And what we are avoiding here is white guilt. And that's bottom line. That's what it is. It's white guilt. And when I use that term white guilt, I'm not talking about the complexion, one's complexion. Because amongst, when we look at that, these things that what we deal with, it comes from the mental, our mental attitude. And in a sense that, how we utilize and manipulate basically societies, like even in a sense that, even manipulate. That's just like, here locally in Dayton, a lot of people got upset with me when I told them, I said, and don't get me wrong here. I support Gem City Market and I go there. I wanted to succeed. But when I told people, I said, this is a beacon of systemic racism. Understand how the system played a role in the development and how this came to be. If you can look at it, then you see how this developed and how this came to be. The system that was in place and is still in place, does it meet the needs? And I know, it's like over the years, talking with Amaha, we were talking about the health of the community, the physical health of the community. But yet, who controls that physical health? Because when you go there, what do you find? You still find, hamburger helper. You still find those things that are high in sodium in a community that is suffering from hypertension, diabetes, heart problems, cardiac problems, obesity. But yet there's still there's the box of hamburger helper. There's the box dinner. And then it's like, and so how do you change that? And it's like, well, it has to, if you understand the system, how that system plays in and what determines what gets sold at the market. And that was one of the things that, and I've talked to several people. I said, I keep coming down here and I said, hopefully one of these days I'm going to find some wheat bread, some whole wheat bread, or find some, fresh baked bread. And I did, and I did find it. But understanding the system and how did I influence the system by asking those questions. When am I going to find the wheat bread? When am I going to find the homemade bread? When am I going to find the gluten-free bread? Asking those questions and, and creating that atmosphere. That's how we make those changes mentally. We make that they're slow, but it's like we can make those changes, but they have to be, they have to be there. You can't just accept them. So that was one of the things. Like even it was I made several notes here in the sense that because we had all the various terminologies that were getting utilized and stuff, and it's we have to take everything apart. And and the basic, and they're good. Don't get me wrong. They're all good, but there was a reason and a purpose. There was a reason and a purpose, and it's everything has a purpose. There was a point in time where I had some questions, and these questions that I had, and so I did some meditation on it. And I prayed about it, and Darcio called and she says, "Hey, I want you to meet my dad." I met her dad, and I found my answer. It's like those are the things now. It helped me find my own answer. But you see, those are the kind of things that when we begin to recognize them and appreciate them, and and then it's like, and so now I have a relationship with her father and the Sikh community. I go there, and by the way, the food is delicious. um so I just I do that, but that's building, like what Shelley was talking about, building that community. And it's like, and so I go have coffee with the Eritreans. I go eat with I just recently met a family from the Congo. So we're having these dialogues because they were like, "We're Black," and I'm like, "That's America." Because suddenly they came here and they're Black, and it's like, that's America. And so understanding and having those conversations, but it's but rethinking them. And it's I hear words like now, and people I talk to, and they talk about awakening, and it's there is no awakenings. It's being yourself. It's being yourself. And it's like, and people are always like, "What do you mean?" It's I meditate, and I get to that place that's just me. And I examine myself without the world, without all this influence. It's just me. And you'd be amazed at what you find there when you begin to embrace yourself. Embrace yourself. Understand those fears, those joys, that happiness. Understanding those. So that's one of the things that but it's that terminology. Mentally, we got to make some shifts, and we got to make some changes up here mentally. So,
and I think that's so huge, is when you're in that shifting space, when you recognize that you are, period.
mm-hmm.
You are.
Mm-hmm.
And when you strip away all of the messages that you've been given and all of the labels that have been put on you and all of the things that society has told you, mm-hmm. right, that you are, and just be,
mm-hmm.
there's a totally different level of understanding of self that you will receive.
Mm-hmm.
When you're born, you're placed into immediate labels of who you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to behave and what color you're supposed to wear, what color blanket you're allowed to have, and you know, you get into these categories that are man-made, that are constructs that don't even align with who you are. I tell folks all the time, you know, when you were a baby, you didn't have these viewpoints and these, you know, this understanding of the world. It didn't exist. You were just living as you. So at what point did your perception change? At what point did your perspective change? At what point did you start to adapt all of these things that society has put upon you? And I think when it comes to legislation and influencing our legislators, that you have to ask those questions. Those questions matter. And when you can actually have those conversations and share that perspective, you know, oftentimes YWCA, we go and we provide testimony, but the testimony we provide is not full of statistics and research. Although we share that aspect too, we tell the story of the community. We talk about the actual impact for the real people who are experiencing, who are living, going through, who are suffering, who are impacted. And it's those stories and that understanding and the questions that are asked that lead people to reconsider their thought process and reconsider where they stand. And yet we have so many folks out here who don't even know where to begin in that process, and don't feel like their voices matter and don't feel like their vote matters. As I look at legislative fact sheets that I create about legislators for internally for our folks before they go and meet with them, I go through their biography and look at who they portray themselves to be. And then I go through all of the active space that they've been in and look at what bills have they sponsored and co-sponsored. What are the messages that they stand for and what they believe in? And what I find is that it's often not what we think. And I believe we've been misled into believing that there are these parties that have these viewpoints that we should subscribe to, when in reality, each person is an individual. And where they are in their self-discovery and where they are in their knowledge of culture, where they are in their knowledge of the world, and where they are in their knowledge and understanding of impact plays a huge role in every decision that they're going to make. And so I recognize that there are some individuals who, on the outside, another person would say, oh, they support everything that you stand for. And when I actually look at who they are, they seem just as conflicted as the next person. And are they really taking a stand because it's what they believe, or for the sake of these systems that are created, these monetary gain systems, these systems of economy, systems of capitalism, systems of the legal system, and so on and so forth? And I believe, you know, there are some very basic things that should be afforded to us as human beings. Things like food, right? As Kayla mentioned earlier. But the Healthy Food for All Americans Act hasn't passed in 5 years. Why?
See, this is like, you know, somebody asked me the other day about, you know, today. And I said, you know, one of the most immoral acts in our society today, I said, is we have to pay for water. I said, the Creator put this here for all of us, and we have to pay for it.
For water, for air.
That is immoral.
It is. We're paying for, I say it all the time, we have to pay for water, for air, for food, for things that are here to our survival. Humans cannot survive without these things. And yet, so many are suffering because of that, because of the systems that are built to say that we have to pay for it, or that we can't afford it, or to even know and suggest that there is water that is unsafe, and people are paying for that. The fact that we have to ask our legislators to create an act or reauthorize an act that says you can't be violent against women, the lifeline of our species. It's beyond me. Yet this is where we are in our society. And for our audience, we only have a few minutes left. So if there are any questions that you had and you wanted to throw them in the chat, please feel free to ask us a question as we close out with some last thoughts and last statements. Kayla?
Sorry, it's just a little loud over here. Are you asking for a closing statement? Okay. Yeah, I so appreciate the opportunity to think about this more and to hear from all of you. I think I think that it's I think the thing that I'm like sort of coming to, like the only thing that I think I would have left to say, right, is when you're thinking about a system and when you're thinking about how the system is being upheld, thinking about my role in that, right, and growing up, that there's no way that I am not racist, right? There's no way, and sort of like acknowledging that. And I think that's like so important in this step as a, as a white Jewish person, whatever, whoever identifies as that. But I mean, there's steps in this, there's accountability in this, and constantly asking like, how am I part of this? And what do I do as a result? And I think that as a that I think we need to change a little the conversation to sort of baseline that we have rights as human beings, and that coming from like a human rights perspective, I think that a lot of different rights have been mentioned in this conversation, and sort of starting from that assumption that you are in this place and you have rights and you're part of this, and it's about relationships, and yeah, I mean, everybody has said it more eloquently than that, but just with appreciation for providing the space.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share a last closing thought?
I want to just speak a little bit on the critical race theory situation. I'm speaking just from my perspective, which is more outside of the system than inside of it. But I don't personally believe that we need critical race theory to be taught in schools. And I say that because I think the essence of what we're trying to get at is the shared humanity, right? And coming to the humanity. And even in the legislation, they're using white guilt as like it's like you can't teach anything that induces white guilt. Like that's the crux of what they're trying to avoid, is an emotion. And it's like, okay, what are emotions? They connect us to our shared humanity, right? So there's ways I think that we can do the work that needs to be done regardless of what happens to the bill. And I think the essence is like, okay, there are whatever, people who carry that guilt, to Guy's point, no matter what, color skin they have, like go towards that, create spaces like the circles that Shelley was talking about, like these transformative spaces where we can be vulnerable and address, our guilt, our shame, our, whatever it is that's in there that, we're trying to avoid. And the only outcome from that, if we actually are able to move through it, is a more full sense of our humanity and our shared humanity. And so I know there's a lot of like fear towards something like a feeling of guilt. But that's just the tension of the fracture that we're feeling, you know, and like in any healing, whether it's, you know, medical healing, physical healing, emotional healing, you have to go towards the wound to be able to heal it. And so, you know, I don't know what's going to happen with the legislation. I don't know what's going to happen with the education system as it currently stands. I mean, it's already been shifting over the last few years with the pandemic. And people are questioning, like, you know, parents are fighting against critical race theory being taught in schools. They're also fighting against social emotional learning being taught in schools, you know, parallel in the same bills that you mentioned. And so it's like, okay, if that happens or it doesn't happen, these are things that as humanity, as communities, we need to be dealing with anyway. You know, like we probably shouldn't have just been relying on a couple teachers to like do this work of carrying humanity forward. You know, like, and I'm an educator and I value educators and education, but it doesn't have to just be in the school building anymore. And maybe, just maybe, you know, on a large scale, like this is an opportunity for us to take back what we can do, what power we do have, you know, beyond what the legislators are trying to do. So I'm confident that like I'm going to be able to keep moving towards and moving through what I know I'm here to do on this planet, how I'm here to contribute to this, regardless of if the bill passes or not. You know, my employment might change or whatever, but like the work is going to happen regardless. And like we're going to move forward towards where we need to go, or we're not. And like that's just the reality. So yeah, I guess that's my final thoughts. That is like if we center the goal, which is like connecting like connecting what was broken, you know, and becoming more whole, then I think we have pathways to get there, regardless of what happens legally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Would anybody else want to make a closing statement?
I will. So speaking to the aspect as a person who you know suffers and still suffers because of the mentality, right, and the growth that I am achieving and looking to achieve because of that mentality, right, that we've talked about so many times on this call. That key thing to it was to show up and do the work, right? If it means to practice something that you're not familiar with, you know, so for those people that are on the call that may not know how to do this or feel stuck, like know there's a way. And that way is because obviously we want to be better and we want to build this better future. And we want, you know, I want to do it with community and you have your reasons too. But if you don't know the answer, like that's okay. But what you can do is you can speak it into existence. Like remember that your energy and your voice is energy and your thoughts when spoken are energy. And so if you're looking for an answer, you know, which in our tradition, guys and I's culture, you know, we do a lot of prayer, you know, and that prayer is energy and we get a lot of answers that way too. And or it comes in various ways. It comes in dreams. It may come however it needs to come. But when you speak those thoughts and prayers into existence, you know, your voice is energy just as you are. And those answers will come in time. You know, if you're looking for guidance, you know, don't ask for the answer. Ask for the situation to get you there, for what you need in order to get and to move and to shift into that space. If you don't know how to pray, it's okay. Just, you know, say, if you want to say you're better, you know, like people with the affirmations and their mantras. I have my mantras. I have my developed boundaries, you know, and That's what I do. If the things don't align with those, then I don't typically do them. And so you develop those. If you want to be better, what does being better look like? You'll think those things out and then practice them, because it's not, and it won't be easy because you haven't done it. Just keep at it, and and that will give you the beginning steps to the shift that you're looking for. And thank you so much for the space, Taylor. And thank you to all the other panelists for the space. I really appreciate it, and I have tons of gratitude for all of you. Check.
Thank you for being here. Thank you so much. Guy, would you like to share a closing statement?
Yeah, I was I was thinking about something. This morning I had to go see my pulmonary doctor. My doctor is now referred to me as a long hauler. So, I had COVID back a few months ago, and there's some residuals left over from COVID. But anyway, we were talking and stuff, and my doctor was like, "Well, how did you come to that?" Because, he says we just were in a conversation and stuff, and he said, "Well, how did you come to that conclusion?" And I said, "Well, during COVID, I said I developed a relationship with COVID." He's like, "What do you mean you developed a relationship?" And I said, "COVID's a living being." I said, "I talk to it." And I said, "And that's the conclusion I come to." He's like, "You were hallucinating?" And I said, "No, it was very real." I said, "It was my relationship with this living entity, this living being." And he looked at me and he says, "Well, it works." He said, "Your oxygen saturation is really good." And, and the thing of it is this, is that, and once again, it comes back to that mentally and creating those spaces and having working on those relationships. Now, it's, as I was leaving the doctor's office, he said, "You really need to write a book." And that was his last word. He said, "I'll see you in 6 months." So, we can change the world. We can change our world if we recognize our world. And right now, all of you are a part of my world. So thank you.
Oh, I'm so grateful to be in the space with you all. Guy shared that with me as I've been battling long haul COVID as well. And I sat back and I said, wow, society has changed our perspective of living beings and living creation and reduced it to terms like virus in a way that we don't even see it the same. And we don't even see it as a living organism that's within us, which it is. We've been reduced so much around society that it is time for us to not reshape, to imagine ourselves differently, to see ourselves differently, to move about society differently, and to be part of those transformative spaces that can create the shift that needs to take place for us to see better within our society and within our world. I'm so grateful to each and every one of you for exchanging breath, for giving life, for pouring out, overflowing into this community in the way that you do, into our global world in the way that you do. I think that it's important that our audience knows not only do you shape within yourself in your own thinking, you speak it out. And that voice comes in many different forms. I urge you, if you're not registered to vote, to do that. Get registered to vote so that you can share your thoughts and share your voice and share your perspective in that system that exists, although it doesn't work very well. I urge you to have those conversations with representatives. take the time to talk. Whether it's the local representatives, whether it's your state representatives, whether it's just representatives of your community. Take the time to share space. Take the time to speak out. If you want to learn more about how you do that, sign up for our next edition of the 21-day challenge, where we unpack the histories and unpack what's happening now and unpack how to move forward and unpack what healing looks like. Volunteer to help in your community. Volunteer to be a part of the shift. Volunteer yourself and your time to go and learn from another culture or another group, to sit at their feet and listen to their stories, to appreciate the difference around you and appreciate the humanity that we all share. If you have it within yourself, you can always donate of your time, of your services, of your effort, of your resources. Share those out. Some of us didn't grow up with green space, so we may not know how to commune with nature. These are things that you can share with someone else. And then participate, commit, whether that's adding your name to a letter that says we are declaring racism as a public health crisis and humanity is at stake here, or whether it is just learning about other opportunities to get engaged in your own community. Martin Luther King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And we all have a social responsibility to our society, to one another, and to the earth that we live on and live in and live with. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Take care.